Hello friends, welcome back. Welcome to our detailed analysis of GS-1 question paper of Civil Services Examination 2021. Friends, this basically GS-1 paper was scheduled and held on 8th of January 2022. And in fact, this is actually the second paper in sequence when it comes to mains examination of civil services. The first paper, which took place on 7th of January, was on essay writing. And this year's paper on essay has been talk of the town. A lot of discussion has happened, including my own Twitter handle, wherein I have shared the question paper. And if you look at the question paper on essay appears to have deviated from the previous trend of UPSC essay writing, wherein the questions were more based on issues. The issues could be based on basically current affairs, the issues could be based on women related issues, the issues could be based on children related issues, could be based on education, health, or something which is going on globally. But this year's question paper on essay appears to be more biased and inclined towards questions which might have been leaning towards English literature, or aspirant students, or basically people who might have knowledge about philosophy. But today's discussion is not going to be dedicated to essay question paper. Rather, in today's discussion, we are going to focus squarely and fairly on GS1, General Studies 1 question paper. If you look at the quality, the standard, the mix of the questions which actually appeared in GS1 question paper this year, it appears to be a classic UPSC style question paper. It is extremely analytical. Not much of the lot learning will actually help you to attempt this question paper. Similarly, if you look at the mix of questions, the questions were asked from history, and when I say history, all three kinds of history: ancient history, medieval history, and modern history. Similarly, there were questions which were basically from environmental science and disaster management. Similarly, there were basically questions from different global events. There were questions from Indian geography, there were questions from physical geography, and obviously there were questions from society, tribal affairs. There were questions from women related issues, and obviously there were questions from current affairs. So if you overall look at GS1 question paper of Civil Services Examination 2021, which basically took place on 8th of January 2022, it appears to be a very standard classic UPSC style mains question paper. The questions were not direct per se. They are not fact based, but if you know the facts and you understand the question and you can nicely basically correlate and put up those facts to answer that pointed question, I think it's easy go. But before we deep dive into each of those individual questions, in fact, each of those individual areas which were covered in this year's GS1, I think it's pertinent to basically have a quick look at the syllabus of GS1. Because before or without understanding actually what the syllabus of GS1 is, what is expected in GS1 question paper, it will be very difficult for you or for anybody per se to correlate those questions with the syllabus of Civil Services Mains Examination. So friends, on screen here you basically look at the syllabus which has been prescribed in the notification by UPSC scheduled for UPSC CSE Mains Examination 2021. So if you look at page number 32 of the UPSC notification, it clearly articulates that paper 2, which is actually General Studies 1, will contain Indian heritage and culture, history, geography of the world, and basically society. So this is like the broad headline of what is expected in syllabus of paper 2, which is General Studies 1 of Civil Services Examination. If you break it down into various subtopics, then it appears to cover Indian culture. That will basically cover the salient aspects of all the art forms, which is called art and culture, literature, architecture from ancient times to modern times. Now, this is a very broad basically subject in itself. The second one is modern Indian history from about middle of the 18th century, almost from wherein the British started to land on the Indian subcontinent until the present significant events, important personalities, important issues. The third basically subtopic under General Studies 1 is the freedom struggle, its various stages, important contributors, players, leaders, and their contributions from different parts of the country, different regions of the country. Then it also covers post-independence consolidation. And when I say post-independence consolidation, you had a very direct question in this year's GS1 question paper, which we are going to talk about once we jump back to the actual questions which were asked in this year's GS1 question paper. And then it also talks about the reorganization within the country post-independent. Then it talks about history of the world, and that will include events from the 18th century, particularly from Industrial Revolution times, world wars, redrawal of the national boundaries, colonization, decolonization, political philosophies like communism, capitalism, socialism, etc., their forms and their effect on the society. Then the next important topic would be salient features of the Indian society, the diversity of our country, diversity of India. Then it also covers role of women, women's organization, population, associated issues, poverty, development issues, urbanization, their problems and their potential remedies or their potential solutions. It also seems to cover globalization on basically Indian cities, the impact of basically globalization on Indian society, Indian cities, India as a whole. Then it also covers social empowerment, communalism, regionalism, and secularism. Then it talks about salient features of the world's physical geography. So here, it seems to have traveled from history, all three types of history, art and culture, post-independence history, world history. Then we have talked about Indian society, diversity, issues related to women, population, poverty, development issues, urbanization, Indian society, Indian cities. Then we have talked about empowerment, communalism, regionalism, secularism. Then we have talked about physical geography. And when we start with physical geography, I think the conversation discussion won't end up before we actually talk about distribution of key natural resources. And you had a very direct question based on this subtopic, which is distribution of key natural resources across the world, including South Asia and Indian subcontinent. Then it also talks about the factors which are responsible for location of primary, secondary, and tertiary sector industries in various parts of the world, including our own country, India. Then it talks about important geophysical phenomena such as earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic activity, and you had two direct questions from this basically particular subtopic of GS1 syllabus. It talks about cyclones, etc. Then it also talks about geographical features, their location changes in critical geographical features, including water bodies, ice caps. This also had a direct question in this year's civil services examination mains GS1 question paper. It also talks about flora, fauna, and basically effects of such changes. So friends, this is basically the overall syllabus which is expected in General Studies 1 of Civil Services Mains Examination. So now you have a broad understanding that it covers history, all three kinds of history. It covers geography, which is Indian geography, physical geography, and world geography. Then it also basically covers issues which are related to Indian society, India as a country. Then it also talks about some of the current affairs. So overall, if you have a broad understanding of all these basically topics, you will be in a very good position to answer most of the questions which might appear in any of the General Studies 1 paper of Civil Services examination. And now we will go through each of those 20 questions which basically appeared in GS1 of this year's mains examination. And from there on, we will tie each of those questions back to the syllabus we have just basically discussed. Because if the syllabus is not clear in your head, then you won't be able to figure out what is the scope of study for each of those question papers, be it GS1, GS2, GS3, GS4. And similarly, same thing basically goes for your optional question paper as well. So I hope you got a pretty good understanding of what the syllabus of GS1 looks like. And now let's jump back to this year's question paper. Let's briefly go through each of those questions and then correlate, tie them up with basically the syllabus which has been prescribed for the mains GS1 CSE syllabus. Then we will also go through in very brief about the possible answers to the questions which were basically asked in this year's GS1 question paper, so as to give you a broader understanding of how to understand questions, how to approach questions, and how to basically approach the answer writing of those questions. Because friends, in UPSC, in IAS exam, in civil service examination, time is of key essence, like we have described in 2 of our previous lectures on basically answer writing. And same thing we expanded in much more detail in our 3rd lecture on mains answer writing, that understanding the question, correlating the question, and getting the gist of the question is the first part of the equation. And once you have understood the question, you have understood the message which has been contained in the question or the pointed question which has been asked by the examiner, the second part is collecting and recollecting and recalling all the data, facts, figures, historical background, the current affairs, the way forward, etc., the diagrams, key players, leaders, events, etc., related to that particular question or that particular basically topic. And then you start to jot it down in a logical sequence fashion. So let's begin with question number 1 of this year's GS1 question paper of Civil Services Examination 2021. Question number 1. Question number 1 states that evaluate the nature of the Bhakti literature and its contribution to Indian culture. Answer in 150 words, and it carries a weightage of 10 basically marks. So first of all, you have to think it's 150 words, and 150 words, if you look at a plain sheet of paper, how much of it should you be filling or writing so that approximately that will constitute 150 words. In my experience, I have basically taken or written 2 mains examination. The first one has been CSE 2016 and the next one second attempt 2017, and 150 words mean about a page and a half, maximum maybe 2 pages back and forth. You should not be writing or aiming to write anything more than that, because if you start to basically write more, you won't be able to complete all your questions, you won't be able to answer all your questions. So ultimately you might gain half a mark extra in one of the questions, but ultimately you might end up not answering 1 or 2 or 3 questions. So it's basically in totality will be a loss to you. So a page and a half, maximum 2 pages, but that is only in rare cases. Writing 2 pages for 150 marks should not become your norm, otherwise you will struggle majorly while completing your question paper. So first question is about Bhakti literature. Then it talks about its contribution to Indian culture. But before we get there, it says evaluate. If you look at our lecture number 2, it basically, in lecture number 3 on basically mains answer writing, it clearly says evaluate means it has to be an overall evaluation. It has to be an overall examination wherein you have to cover some historical background, you have to cover the positives of it, then you have to also cover the negative or criticism or the other side of the coin of it as well. So you don't have to just limit yourself to the positive side of impact of Bhakti literature on Indian culture, but if you find any gaps or lacunas or negative sides, then you must also not hesitate from highlighting those. Then it will become a evaluate like answer. Then you will balance it out. So 3 keywords: Bhakti literature, contribution, Indian culture, and everything has to be put together in an evaluate perspective. Evaluate, tail word, evaluate, keyword, basically frame. When you say Bhakti literature, I think obviously your answer would start from defining Bhakti literature. For example, what do we mean by Bhakti? Define Bhakti in a line or basically 2. And Bhakti could be simply, it might refer to devotion. It might be a moment which might be emphasizing mutual intense devotion to basically a personal god or basically god of the devotee. And then you also have to talk about the time frame when this Bhakti movement took place in India. And this took place between 7th and 10th century, basically CE. And mostly this was in poems of Alwars and Nainars of South India, who were actually addressing or devoting themselves to Lord Vishnu and Lord Shiva respectively. And then you talk about that Bhakti movement which got started from South India very quickly started to spread to the north part of India, particularly by the 10th century, or If you look at one of the very famous texts of Bhakti literature, then this was Sanskrit text, the Bhagavad Purana. And then once you have defined Bhakti movement, once you define Bhakti literature, then basically you must also define that what were the reasons which actually led to emergence of Bhakti movement. And it could be a number of reasons. For example, spread of Islam, a reaction to that. It could be emergence of great reformers who wanted you to break away from the traditional methods of basically worship or devotion. It could also be influence of Sufi sects or Sufi saints. It could also be influence of Vaishnavism and Shaivism ideologies, first in South India, and then eventually it translated itself to north parts of India as well. So that is basically the initial part, first half page. This is Bhakti movement. This is why it got started. This was the time frame. This was the origin. And this is how it traveled. So when the examiner is reading your answer, he understands that you have a broad understanding of the question or the topic which has been asked to you, which is about Bhakti movement. So once you have defined Bhakti movement, the next part is define basically Bhakti literature, because the question is not about Bhakti movement. The question is more about Bhakti literature or the literature which was written down during the Bhakti movement. So then you'll start to jot down some of the key important leaders. For example, Sankaracharya. For example, Ramajanacharya. For example, Nimbraka. For example, Madhvacharya. For example, Baswana, Ramananda, Kabir, Guru Nanak, etc., etc. And then you also start to list out the important key literary events or sources or texts which were basically articulated during this entire span of Bhakti movement. So that is your second piece. I define Bhakti, I define important leaders, define important Bhakti literature, and my last part then would be to define its contribution towards Indian society. For example, one of the important impacts of Bhakti movement or this entire reform process is this advocated, Bhakti movement advocated to basically reform most of the major religions and to ensure that they get rid of their traditional, obsolete social practices. So this was a huge contribution to Indian society. That this also promoted growth of regional languages. Similarly, it also created an important platform for unification of the country under a national consciousness. It basically raised awareness not only in South India but from South India to entire North India as well. Similarly, this also contributed to development of music, dance, literature, art and culture. Similarly, this also challenged, checked the orthodox supremacy. Also, this majorly contributed to Indian society because this led to creation of a very positive environment when it comes to emancipation of vulnerable sections of the society. Also, it led to an improvement in social relationship between Hindus and Muslims because of the role of the Sufi saints. Similarly, overall, if you look at the entire spectrum of Bhakti movement and the literature which was created during this entire span, then this led to a major promotion of social services. This is basically how you are going to tie these knots. Start with the definition, talk about the specific point. The question is not about Bhakti movement but about Bhakti literature. List out our leaders, the Bhakti literature and its impact and contribution to Indian society. And in the end, if you find any gaps, for example, there could be regions which might have been left out from this entire influence of Bhakti movement. There might be sections, there might be impact on women which might be very limited when it comes to impact of Bhakti movement, impact of Bhakti literature on those sections, those regions, those states, those areas of the countries. Those could be some of the gaps which you might want to point out at the very tail end of the answer, because the questions ask you to evaluate. The question does not ask you to basically narrate. The question does not ask you to discuss. The question asks you to evaluate. Evaluate means you have to know both sides of the coin. So that's question number 1. Let's move on to question number 2. Question number 2 talks about trace the rise and growth of socio-religious reform movements with special reference to Young Bengal and Brahmo Samaj. 150 words, 10 basically marks. Now, this question, look at the tail word first. It says trace. It does not say evaluate. It does not say critically examine. It does not say critically analyze. It does not even say analyze. It simply says trace or narrate. Trace means I just have to list out the chronology of the growth of socio-religious reform movements, and I have to make special references to very specific events. And those two specific events are rise of Young Bengal and Brahmo Samaj movements, their contribution, their key players, their time frames, their impact on the Indian society, and also their limitation perhaps. But because it says trace, it's basically a chronological narration. This is more like narrate. Very clear? Tail word is trace. Circle this down. Then socio-religious reform movements. Circle that down. Then two special references, Young Bengal and Brahmo Samaj. It means I have to talk about the reform movements which took place during this time frame, and then I have to basically devote some dedicated space and time and detail to Young Bengal and Brahmo Samaj movements. How they started, who important leaders were, what their basically line of thinking was, and also how they helped Indian society into bringing about some of the important reforms. At the same time, we might also want to list out some of the limitations these two movements might have faced. But compared to question number 1, this is not a evaluate. This is just a trace type question. List down things in a chronological sequence with special reference to two of the important socio-religious reform movements called Young Bengal and Brahmo Samaj. So how an answer to this question could look like? Think about it. Just take a 5-second pause before you start to write and frame the answer in your mind. This is how I'm to start. This is what my body of the question would be. This will be my diagram, and this will be basically my facts. This is how I'm going to end this question. So, a possible answer to this question could be tracing. So, first of all, go back in the times, because Young Bengal movement and Brahmo Samaj movement, they both took place in basically the modern times. So, you must first of all understand, apart from these two movements, which were other socio-religious movements which basically took place on the Indian subcontinent during those particular time frames. So, start with a narration of the time frame on which the question has been framed. These were basically the socio-economic conditions, socio-religious conditions, and in reaction to them, a lot of basically socio-religious reforms started to take place. List them down and then focus mainly on Young Bengal movement. For example, what was Young Bengal movement? Who was its important leader like Henry Vivian Desrosiers? And when this happened? 1831. Where did it happen? Bengal, the Hindu College of basically Calcutta. For example, some of the key important teachings of this Young Bengal movement were promotion of radical ideas through the teachings of Henry Vivian Desrosiers by organizing an association for debates, discussion on literature, history, philosophy and science. I mean, this was more modern looking, more outward looking, more out of the box thinking. Similarly, Young Bengal movement wanted to spread intellectual revolution among particularly the young students. Similarly, it had a great propounder of liberal thinking. It also was a vehement supporter of freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of education for women. Similarly, it tried to defy the social and religious conventions. They also stated that the radical views with the roots of religious philosophy, the old orthodoxy of all the major religions should be challenged. They also ridiculed the old social traditions, customs, and debated the existence of God. So these were the basic tenets. This is what the kind of reform they tried to bring in. Similarly, you list down for Brahmo Samaj, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, the key basically leaders of that movement, the key teachings or basically ideas and salient features of that particular social-religious movement, and the kind of people who got associated with it, the success of it, and some basically limitations or failures of it. And ultimately, you will have to conclude by saying that what kind of changes were these reform movements, these socio-religious reform movements, particularly the Young Bengal movement and the Brahmo Samaj movement, were able to bring about in the Indian society, or in basically areas or districts or states where they primarily operated. This is how your answer has to be for question number 2 of GS1 paper. Now we move to question number 3, which is assess. So the tail word is assess. It's not evaluate, it's not trace. It's assess the main administrative issues and socio-cultural problems in the integration process of Indian princely states. 150 words, 10 marks. So tail word assess, circle it down. Then main administrative issues. Next important word, I have to identify main administrative issues and also social cultural problems. So I have to assess both administrative issues as well as the socio cultural problems, and in respect of what? In respect to integration process of Indian princely states. So 3 basically important things: administrative issues, socio-cultural problems, integration process of what? Indian princely states. So take a 5-minute pause, think in your head, how would you like to frame an answer to question number 3? Now this question is obviously related to post-independent India. So this will be covered under, now go back to the syllabus part of it that talks about the post-independence integration. A direct question from it, very, very basic question. To answer this question, a good way to start would be to define what the Indian princely states were. So a definition of princely state would be a very good way to start. Princely states were also called as native states. They were also called as feudatory states. They were also called as Indian states. And the reason they were called so, because they basically acted as vassal states under a local or indigenous or regional ruler under Subsidiary Alliance Act with the East Indian Company. And after 1857 revolt, under an agreement under 1858 with the British Crown, they were given a lot of autonomy, but then they had to be submissive and pay an homage to the British Crown directly. Such states were basically called the princely states. And when India got independence, after the British withdrawal, how many princely states did we have? We had more than 565 princely states that were officially recognized in the Indian subcontinent, apart from thousands of Jamindari estates and also basically Jagirs. So if you look at 1947, more than 40% of the pre-independence India and roughly 23% of our population that resided in the princely states. And some of the most important British political princely states were Hyderabad, Nizam, Mysore, Travancore, Jammu and Kashmir, Sikkim, etc., even Indore. So they were spread from north to south to east to basically west. And having them integrated in the post-independent scenario proved to be a major administrative challenge, as well as it also came with different socio-cultural issues. So first we try to define what Indian princely states were, how many of them, kind of setup arrangement they had with the British Crown, and now we basically come to what we did or how did we manage under leadership of our first Home Minister, Shri Vallabhbhai Pant and VP Menon, to basically integrate them through a lot of awareness, through a lot of persuasion, through some of the coercive measures to ensure that they actually get subsumed or integrated with basically India as a nation. And also define in doing so, in this process of getting them integrated with India, what kind of administrative issues. For example, some of the princely states like Hyderabad, Travancore, even Jammu and Kashmir, they refused to a certain extent not integrate themselves with India. What kind of measures were taken during those times to ensure that the integration does take place? Similarly, what kind of socio-cultural disconnect these princely states might have with rest of the India, and how our post-independence leadership managed to overcome those issues and eventually have them integrated with the larger country that is called India. So this is how we are going to define the overall framework of basically this question. Define Indian princely states, define the challenge we had, 565, define different setup they were under. That itself was a huge administrative challenge because they were not under directly the East India Company after 1858. In fact, they were then placed under the British Crown directly. And when Britishers were basically, I would say, kicked out from India. These princely states were arbitrarily given a choice by our colonial masters to choose whether they would want to get integrated with India or not. And they did that on purpose with an aim of basically fusing, with an aim of inserting discontent within the post-independent Indian administration. But good sense prevailed, and with iron fist, a leadership like Vallabhbhai Patel and VP Menon managed to eventually integrate all of these Indian princely states into the country post-independence. Question number 4. Differentiate the causes of landslides in the Himalayan region and Western Ghats. Now, this question is from which part of the syllabus? This question is clearly from disaster management, or I would say physical geography, or I would say even Indian geography, or you could also correlate this with some of the current events which we have basically faced both in the Himalayan region as well as Western Ghats. Now, let's read the question again. Is this question about evaluate? No. Is this question about trace? No. Is this question about assess? No. This is a question which says differentiate. It means we don't have to define the landslides which are happening in Himalayan region or the Western Ghats. In fact, we have to establish a clear-cut differentiation between the kind of landslides, the reasons for landslides we see in Himalayan region compared to the Western Ghats. So, it is not asking about generic answers of landslides in the Himalayan region or the Western Ghats. It's asking a very specific pointed question that you got to know the basic differences between the landslides which do occur in Himalayan region and which do occur in the Western Ghats. So first of all, correlate these with some of the latest events which might have happened in the Himalayan region when it comes to landslides. Like, landslides are fairly common, particularly during monsoon season in the Himalayan region. And a lot of reasons might be attributed to them. For example, Himalayas themselves are young fold mountains. They are still under movement. Their basically height is still rising. Their tectonic plates are still shifting. And also a lot of dams, a lot of natural anthropogenic factors are also contributing to the recent landslide events which we might have been basically facing in the Himalayan region. Wherein Western Ghats are a lot more stable. They are not basically categorized as young fold mountains. And when it comes to tectonic shift, because of being in Deccan Plateau, they are a lot more stable. So I would say the key difference between landslides in Himalayan region and in the Western Ghats is Himalayan region has both natural as well as anthropogenic, means also human induced landslide which are taking place in the Himalayan regions, be it Jammu and Kashmir, be it basically Himachal Pradesh, etc., etc., etc. Wherein when it comes to Western Ghats, there have been a number of reports. For example, Kasturirangan report, which very clearly articulates along with Gadgil reports that Western Ghats, almost 80% of these Western Ghats must be basically declared as eco-sensitive zone because so much human activity has started to take place, encroachments have started to take place, which actually is the major reason behind landslides which do occur in the Western Ghats. In fact, if you go to our YouTube channel, you go to Environmental Science and Disaster Management playlist, you will have 2 lectures which are dedicated to issues which are happening in the Western Ghats. When it comes to environmental science, also disaster management, what have been key recommendations of Gadgil report, key recommendations of the Kasturirangan report, and what the state has done. When I say state, it means the state governments as well as the national government. Also, one of the major decisions of NGT and some of the major interventions of the highest court of our country, which is the Supreme Court of India. So, if you basically go through that particular lecture, you will be in a position to understand that this is the difference between landslides in the Himalayan region and this is the difference between the landslides which take place in the Western Ghats. And you might want to conclude this answer by a way forward, which is we must basically implement recommendations of the Kasturirangan report or Gadgil report. And then we also might want to balance ecology versus economy. We might want to basically balance. For example, we do need to utilize some of these hilly terrains for our economy, for our developmental purposes, for building dams, for building roads for our national security. If you go to our playlist, you go to infrastructure playlist, you look at the Char Dham Pariyojana video, you will basically very nicely find out that why Char Dham Pariyojana, which spans over 960 kilometers, is important for national security standpoint. But it does carry a risk when it comes to inducing man-made landslides, avalanches in the Himalayan region. So that's how basically you approach question number 4. Question number 5. Despite India being one of the countries of the Gondwana land, its mining and industry contributes much less to its gross domestic product in percentage. Discuss. So first of all, it is discuss. You don't truly have to critically analyze, but you have to have an understanding of both sides of the coin. It means you got to have an understanding of India's mining resource potential. Then you also got to have understanding about its contribution towards Indian GDP. And then start with the question. It says despite. It means even though India is one of the countries of Gondwana land which is actually considered to be geographically very rich in natural resources, be it coal, be it iron ore, be it other basically natural resources. But still, our mining industry has not been able to contribute as much to our GDP, our economy. That is exactly the question, is what is the key reason behind it? What could be a good way? A good way would be, first of all, defining what is the significance of being a part of Gondwana land. What is Gondwana land? And because the question is very specific to mining industry, make sure that you emphasize your answer more about the attributes of Gondwana land when it comes to the resource potential, the mining potential of being a part of Gondwana land. Means because we are being a part of the Gondwana land, the Choto Nagpur Plateau, Deccan Plateau, etc., they are extremely rich when it comes to natural resources, particularly coal, bauxite, mica, iron ore, etc., even uranium, I would say. But if you look at contribution of mining industry to our GDP, it's only 2.2%. Just imagine, we are the second largest basically resource of iron ore and also the second largest producer of iron ore in the entire world. Similar is basically case with coal. Still, why we have to import large amounts of coal? Similarly, why do we have to import large amounts of iron ore to meet our domestic needs? That is exactly what the question is. And the answer to that question could be, even though we are a part of Gondwana land, so naturally we are very endowed with a lot of resource potential, right from north to south or east to west, and particularly the Chota Nagpur Plateau area. But because our industry, maybe the policy we implemented since 1993, which is the first basically mining policy of India, has not been that successful when it comes to promoting our mining industry. And a lot of experts are of the opinion that a large part of our land mass is not even yet mapped or surveyed for its mining industry or mining resource potential. It means we still might have large chunks of Indian subcontinent or basically our own country which has not been surveyed and which has not been assessed for how much capacity, how much mining potential it might hold. So that could be one big reason. The second big reason could be the policy environment in our country. There have been major policy shifts from time to time. We have also seen basically coal scam which happened about a decade back, and after that a lot of coal leases were basically scrapped, and that has led to a big setback when it comes to mining industry's potential, when it comes to its contribution towards Indian GDP. That could be a second big reason. The third big reason could be that instead of promoting our own industry, maybe we might have been over dependent on basically importing coal and iron ore and other important resources from other countries. Maybe we have not invested enough in modernizing our industry. That could be another major reason. Maybe we have not developed the kind of linkages, the kind of logistics, the kind of infrastructure which is required for our mining industry to operate at full potential. Maybe we have not taken steps which have been taken by some of the major mining countries such as Australia. And that could be a big reason of all these impediments when it comes to utilizing our resource potential to our own advantage. So this is basically broadly, you could tie up with what is Gondwana land, why that is naturally endowed, what has been, and you lay out some of the facts. For example, we are like the second largest producer and basically holder of coal and iron ore. These are some of the important areas wherein we hold a lot of, I would say, mining industry potential. And this has been contribution towards GDP, which is only 2.2%. When it comes to industrial sector, this is about 10 or 11%, but that is still far less than one it could have been. So it means there have been things which we have not been able to do to realize the full potential of being a part of Gondwana land, or basically realizing our mining potential to full extent. So this is how question number 5 could potentially be approached. Question number 6. What are the environmental implications of the reclamation of water bodies into urban land use? Explain with examples. Classic question. And if you go to the playlist, which is Environmental Science and Disaster Management, there we had a very detailed lecture about urban flooding when it comes to the city of Bangalore. And that lecture very fairly and squarely targets this particular question, which is, what is the question? The question is, what are the environmental implications? So we have to talk about environmental implications of what? If we reclaim or if we utilize water bodies, for example, ponds, for example, small water bodies, for example, wetlands, for example, rivers, for example, valleys, for urban land use. So 3 important keywords. Circle what? Environmental implications, then reclamation of what? Water bodies. So environmental implications, reclamation of water bodies, urban land use. So first of all, define urban land use. What is urban land use? Urban land use means if you are utilizing anything, any kind of land for urbanization purposes. It could be for residential purposes, it could be for industrialization, it could be for special economic zones, it could also be for infrastructural projects, for example, building roads, for building industries, research and development facilities, etc., 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 or airports, for example. So that is urban land use. What are water bodies? Bangalore, for example, is also called a city of lakes, like Udaipur in Rajasthan. But a lot of these lakes, a lot of these valleys have been choked because of unplanned, unauthorized, or ill-conceived developmental activities, such as residential complexes, such as special economic zones. And because of which, when rain does take place, then because these conduits, this natural drainage patterns are totally taken away, reclaimed for urban land use, they leads to city flooding, urban flooding, instant flooding. And these are basically the environmental implications. So if you start to utilize the water bodies for urban land use, then they won't be acting as basically water storage bodies. They won't be acting as buffer zones when it comes to major rainfall events. Similarly, if you start to utilize them for urban land use, they might actually lead to a lot of other kind of environmental imbalances. For example, we have seen in Bangalore from time and again that when it rains, then you start to see a lot of frothing in basically, or you start to have leather-like appearance in a lot of these water bodies in Bangalore. And similarly, same thing which we have also seen in Yamuna, Delhi this year. During Chhath Puja, you saw a lot of pollution because riverbeds of Yamuna or the banks of Yamuna have actually been either illegally, unauthorizedly been reclaimed for urban land uses. So because it says explain with examples, so instead of giving a generic answer, you also have to bolster your answer with specific examples. It could be an example of Yamuna in NCR, Delhi. It could also be an example of Bangalore. It could also be an example of, for example, Gurgaon, that also faces huge issues. Similarly, Delhi, because all the lakes are gone, all the water bodies are gone, all the wetlands are gone. And when it rains a little, you start to see instant urban flooding. The traffic gets Chukot blocked, buildings basically face a lot of issues. For example, in Bangalore, I think the entire city remained waterlogged for almost 4 or 5 days. And boats had to be deployed. In a city like Bangalore, it's so unimaginable that situation could become so grave, so worse. So this is how you basically approach the question. Question number 7. Mention the global occurrence of volcanic eruptions in 2021, their impact on regional environment. Fairly straightforward question. It basically comes from recent events. Similarly, this is also geography or disaster management type of inspired question, I would say. I think in 2021, more than 70 volcanic eruptions took place. All you have to do is basically give a history of volcanic eruptions which have taken place in last 2 or 3 years, not only in India, but at global level, and then demonstrate their impact on the regional environment. And when you say environment, not only natural environment, but the impact on the society, the impact on the basically communities, local communities, their impact on their rehabilitation, resettlement, their impact on the local economies. This is how you establish interlinkages of the topic of the pointed question which has been asked to you. Question number 8. Why is India considered as a subcontinent? Elaborate your answer. Very simple question. Why is India a subcontinent? Explain that. What is subcontinent? Subcontinent is basically which is not truly a full-fledged continent, but it has all the major features of being called as a continent. And it says elaborate your answer. It means you also have to insert a lot of facts, figures to support what you are suggesting. So my line of argument to establish that India is basically considered as a subcontinent because of its geographical size, because of its geographical location. It has such a vast basically coastline of almost 7,400 kilometers. It also had a huge land boundary which it shares with its neighbors such as Pakistan, Afghanistan, China, Myanmar, Bangladesh, etc., etc. Then this is also home to the second largest population on Mother Earth, which is about 1.35 billion people. Then this is also the largest democracy in the world. Then this also is culturally, socially, religiously, economically very, very diversified in nature. Similarly, look at its natural resource endowment. Look at its geographical regions. Look at its climatic zones. Look at its weather pattern. Look at its defense forces. Look at the diversity. Look at the unity in diversity. So it has all the features. So much variety when it comes to geography, so much variety when it comes to history, so much variety when it comes to art and culture, so much variety when it comes to people, so much variety when it comes to different regions of the country, so much variety when it comes to sharing your basically borders. It has water, basically borders, coastline, huge coastline. It also has a huge basically land boundary, which it shares with a lot of its neighbors, Nepal, Bhutan, China, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Pakistan, Afghanistan, etc., etc. So list out all those features and give some data. For example, you say it has a huge coastline of how many kilometers? Let's say 7,400 kilometers. Similarly, share the land boundary details. These are the countries with which it shares so much basically land boundary. Then also talk about the number of languages which are spoken. Also talk about the population, the rich cultural diversity, the rich natural diversity, the rich basically interlinkages which India enjoys with not only its neighbors from historic times, but also with other parts of the world, with basically other continents, other subcontinents, other regions of the world. That's how you define establishing, cover the entire spectrum, not only the geographical part, but also the economical part, economy part, also the society part, the culture part, the art basically part, historic background part of it. That's how you answer question number 8. Question number 9. Examine the uniqueness of tribal knowledge system and when it compared with mainstream knowledge and cultural system. It means, first of all, examine. Examine means like a doctor. You have to look at the positive side, negative side, what are the threats to the question which has been asked to you. It says, examine the uniqueness of tribal knowledge system. So, two keywords. Uniqueness of what? Tribal knowledge system. And then it says compare. It means you have to compare it with the mainstream knowledge and cultural systems. So first of all, you have to have the understanding of these 4 important key words: tribal knowledge system, mainstream knowledge system, and cultural system. So you have to have understanding of these 2 things. Then you have to identify uniqueness of the tribal knowledge. Why is it unique? In what ways it is unique? It could be socially unique, it could be economically unique, it could be relationship standpoint of uniqueness between relationship which, for example, position of women in tribal societies. For example, community-led basically political system they have. For example, more of an egalitarian society. For example, simple societies. For example, some of the very unique cultural systems. For example, the dormitory system of a lot of tribals across the globe. For example, the traditional, medicinal or traditional, basically natural resource or environmental knowledge of our tribal folks. When I say our, it means global tribal communities. Similarly, the kind of exchanges they enjoy. And I had an optional, which is called anthropology, during my mains examination of both 2016 and 17. Anthropology gives a very good understanding of different tribes across the world, different tribes across our own country, India, and their very unique different kind of cultures, knowledges. And then you define first the tribal knowledge system. Then you define the mainstream knowledge system, which is today's knowledge system, I would say. And then you start to compare the unique features. For example, tribal knowledge is more egalitarian, wherein the mainstream knowledge and cultural system is not as much egalitarian, because there's a lot of differentiation when it comes to mainstream knowledge and cultural system. For example, in mainstream knowledge and cultural system, we have religions, we have caste hierarchy, we have women's subordination to men or patriarchal mindset. Similarly, the way property get transferred in mainstream knowledge and cultural system is very different from tribal knowledge system, tribal cultural system, because a lot of tribals, if you still go to Meghalaya or you basically go to Nayars of Kerala, then there it's more of a matrilineal society compared to a patriarchal patrilineal society. Similarly, there could be more examples from tribes across the world, across the country, wherein the systems they still have or the system they used to have from traditional times do have a very different approach from the mainstream knowledge and cultural system. So do a mix and match, do a clear-cut comparison of maybe 6 or 7 different unique features of the tribal knowledge, of the tribal societies, of the tribal cultures, and comparing them with what? Compare them with the mainstream knowledge and cultural systems of today's basically world. For example, they still live in joint families. For example, for them, a clan or a lineage is much more important than nuclear families. So the family culture is different. The household is basically different. The relationship within household is different. The exchanges might be more based on barter system rather than money system. Similarly, their trade might be different. Their social practices might be different, etc., etc., etc. That's what question number 9 is asking you to write down. Question number 10. Examine the role of gig economy in the process of empowerment of women in India. Very interesting question. 10 marks, 150 words. So, if you go to playlist, which is on women empowerment, there you will have 2 very powerful lectures around the issues which Indian women basically is facing when it comes to its economic participation in the Indian economy. We have been witnessing a declining female labor force participation. What has been our female labor force participation in recent times? It has reduced from about 36% to only 24%, wherein the global average of women, female labor force participation is more like 46-47%. It means our female folks are not able to contribute to our economy to the extent which is expected of them, which has been global average. You look at Bangladesh, for example, it's more like 70%. You look at China, it's more like 74%. You look at US, it's more like 80%. You look at South Korea, it's more like 86-87%. So even though we have recently become 3.1 trillion economy, the 6th largest economy in the world, and probably the 3rd largest economy when it comes to PPP, which is purchasing power parity. But still, the picture is very gloomy when it comes to empowerment of Indian women, when it comes to the economic processes. They have not been able to get the fair share of this economic development, of the economic opportunities which this fastest major economy has generated over last decade and a half. What are those key issues? If you basically go through this 15 minutes of our second lecture on the playlist which is based on women empowerment, you will have answers to all your questions. Maybe the environment is not right in India. Maybe we are not able to offer them the right kind of jobs. Maybe we don't have the child care support in India, which is not letting our female folks to go out and basically work. Similarly, most of the female folks are engaged more in agriculture, and agriculture has been stagnating for last few decades. And that's why the opportunities which are created either in service sector or manufacturing, the female folk has not been able to get many or much benefits out of those new opportunities. So that is question number 10. Examine. It means we achieved massive growth and development when it comes to economic growth, when it comes to gig economy, but has that truly percolated or added to the process of women empowerment in India? The question is squarely no. Support that, but just saying that it has not contributed is not enough, because until and unless you support your statement with data like female labor force participation, instances of rape, molestation, sexual harassment has been on the rise based on NCRB data. Similarly, glass ceiling has been an issue. Similarly, we have not created infrastructure for child care. Similarly, we have seen higher enrollments in education, yet basically lower participation in economic activities. So unless you list out those facts and support them with data, your basically answers will be very bland. What you don't want is give bland gyan. What you want is put up a very powerful answer which is also supported by facts, figures, data, statistics. Then your answer will carry true weightage. So this is how you approach question number 10. So that takes us to question number 11. Question number 11 is very simple. Now, up to question number 10, it was 150 words, 10 marks each. From question number 11 onwards, it's more like 250 words, and 250 words means 2.5 pages. To me, 100 words means one side of the basically blank sheet of an A4 size of paper. And it's 15 marks, so 2.5 pages basically justify the weightage it carries. Now the question is, to what extent did the role of moderates prepare a base for the wider freedom movement? Now go back to syllabus. It talks about basically the freedom movement. And what is the tail word here? Comment. Comment means, do you agree with it? Do you not agree with it? Or if you agree or disagree, to what extent, with what aspects of the question? So let's start to encircle the important basically words or keywords in this question. So first of all, it is to what extent. It means it's asking whether this statement is justified. Is it justified to 100%? Is it justified to 20%, 30%, 40%, partial, impartial, fully? To what extent? The next keyword would be role of moderates. Next one will be prepare a base. And prepare a base for who? Prepare a base for wider freedom movement. It means the question is very clear. To what extent the role which was played by the moderates during Indian freedom struggle did basically prepare or contribute towards placing ourselves to attain freedom through the wider freedom movement in the country? To what extent do you think the moderates were successful in contributing or basically preparing a base for attaining wider freedom movement? If it comes to me, I will say I would significantly agree with the statement that it were moderates who actually, considering the socio-economic political conditions of the time, did play a major role when it comes to bringing the masses together, when it comes to raising awareness among them. Because as a lot of people say, India was not truly a country before we gained independence. There were a lot of small, like we talked about princely states, small kingdoms everywhere. So this concept of India being a nation did not truly exist before the freedom struggle started to take place. So moderates, without basically getting into any violent activities or basically going to the extremism path of freedom movement, they played a major role in educating people, in bringing them on board with the idea that India needs to operate as a country, that India needs to throw away the colonial masters, that India as a country needs to attain freedom through peaceful means. Had they started to basically take recourse to violent measures right from the start, then it is highly likely that the British colonialists would not have liked it and they would have crushed the very nascent freedom struggle right at the very onset of it. And that would have been a disaster when it comes to Indian freedom movement or Indian freedom struggle. So I would say the role which the moderates played to a significant extent was successful in preparing a base for wider freedom movement, because they brought people from different parts of the country, from different castes, from different religions, with different backgrounds, illiterates, literates, peasants class, elite class, some of the rulers, people who got education outside of India, towards a common purpose, which is to get united and then focus their minds on basically contributing, devoting themselves, and being a part of the wider freedom movement. Then eventually, a lot of basically Indian freedom fighters started to emerge, a lot of leaders started to emerge, and then they started to lead our freedom movement from one phase to another. So that is question number 11. Question number 12. Bring out the constructive programs of Mahatma Gandhi during non-cooperation movement and civil disobedience movement. Fairly straightforward question. It basically is asking you what were those constructive programs. So constructive programs were around sanitation. They were around upliftment of Dalits, Harijans, or of the deprived societies, upliftment and empowerment of women folk, a lot of basically farm reforms, a lot of farm movements, for example, Champaran, Satyagraha, Dandi March, etc., etc., etc. So what were those constructive works and how did they contribute during non-cooperation movement and civil disobedience movement? I think this is more of a fact-based question. If you list out those different constructive programs of Mahatma Gandhi ji, you very well will be in a position to basically define their contribution towards non-cooperation movement and civil disobedience movement. Question number 13. There arose a serious challenge to the democratic state system between the two world wars. Interesting. So the question is from which part of the syllabus? The question is from the world history part of the syllabus. And it says that between two world wars, it means World War I to World War II, whatever might have happened, the kind of leadership which might have emerged, the kind of systems or political systems or state systems which might have emerged, put actually the democratic state system into grave threat. Do you agree? Do you not agree? It says evaluate the statements. You might choose to agree, you might choose to disagree, you might choose to partially agree, partially disagree. Three keywords. The first of all, serious challenge. Second of all, democratic systems. And third, between two world wars. So just take yourself to World War I and think how the world was when World War I took place. And then think about it. Play it down in your own head is what happened between World War I until World War II. Did the world become more democratic? Or did the world started to drift away from democratic state system to more of either monarchical state system or basically more of autocratic system or dictatorial system? What do you think? How was the world was when World War I took place? When World War I took place, if you look at globe, particularly Europe, the world was more or less democracy. Because before World War I, through different freedom struggles, be it French Revolution, be it in Germany, be it in US, be it in Austria-Hungary, be it in England, a lot of other basically places, majority of the countries did started to enjoy having a democratic state system because those monarchical systems were overthrown through these different revolutions which took place in different parts of Europe and US. But then after World War I, the tendency started to change, and instead of getting more democratic, which appears to be a natural progression of any political system, the world started to become more of a dictatorial kind of basically political system or dictatorial state system. And you can basically point out some of the leaders of these two time spans between World War I and World War II. For example, rise of Mussolini in Italy. For example, rise of Hitler in Germany. For example, rise of Stalin in basically Russia. And there could be other small time dictators elsewhere in the globe as well. It means between World War I or at the onset of World War I, the world was far more democratic than it became between World War I and World War II. And in fact, if you look at why World War II took place, a major reason of that is because of the dictatorial tendencies of countries like Germany. That is what actually led to World War II. It means we were far more democratic during World War I, and then between World War I and World War II, we started to become more dictatorial than we were before World War I. So, the statement, there arose a serious challenge to democratic state system between the two world wars. Evaluate the statement. I think we do agree with the statement. There was tendencies from Russia to Germany to Italy to other parts of basically Europe and rest of the world, I would say, wherein instead of strengthening the democratic systems, the tendencies were leaning more towards basically dictatorial statehood systems. So that is question number 13. Question number 14. Briefly mention the alignment of major mountain ranges of the world and explain their impact on local weather conditions with examples. Now, this is a question straight out of the physical geography or world geography. I don't think we should be spending more time on it because you must know the different mountain ranges, including the Himalayas, etc., and their impact on different local weather conditions. Question number 15. How do the melting of Arctic ice and glaciers of Antarctic differently affect the weather patterns and human activities on the earth? Now again, this question is related to what? This question is related to climate change. This question is related to environmental science. This question is also related to disaster management. And this question, if you look at from a root analysis standpoint, this question is related to physical geography. It means melting of the Arctic ice and glaciers of the Antarctic, they have an impact on weather patterns and human activities on the earth. How does it impact the local weather conditions? How does this basically impact the societies out there? How does it impact the increase in sea level? How does it impact the economy? Because the economy might have a different pattern, but when they have started to impact, there would be basically a change or shift in the economic activities. How does that impact global findings, or basically how does that also impact the global monopoly over Arctic resources? This is what you have to list down in question number 15. That melting of Arctic ice and glaciers of Antarctic do have an impact on the weather patterns and also on human activities which are basically have or are surrounded or are impacted by the Arctic and Antarctic. Question number 16. Discuss the multidimensional implications of uneven distribution of mineral oil in the world. Very simple question. It says, discuss the multidimensional implications. Means not only economic, but it could be social, it could be trade related, it could be geopolitics, it could be national security, it could be new technology, it could be shifting alliances, it could be basically change in consumer pattern because of the uneven distribution of mineral oil in the world. So that is basically what the question is. It means multidimensional implications, and we just have to discuss. No negatives, positives. We just have to have a plain talk about it. Multidimensional implications of what? Uneven distribution. The word is uneven. It means that distribution of whatever is the subject of discussion is not even. It's unevenly distributed across the world. Of what? Mineral oil. It means three keywords: multidimensional implications, uneven distribution of mineral oil. So first of all, define mineral oil. What is mineral oil? Mineral oil is basically the base of production of the fossil fuels, petroleum, diesel, etc., etc. Now, I, having spent almost 10 years in oil and gas industry as a drilling engineer across the globe, including the US, Russia, Nigeria, etc., etc., have a pretty good understanding of this skewed or uneven distribution of mineral oil resources. For example, a lot of mineral oil or basically natural oil or natural oil and gas is deposited in Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Dubai, etc., etc., Oman, for example, Russia, simply US and Canada. But when it comes to India, you don't truly find large deposits of mineral oil and gas in India. So that's why it's unevenly distributed. Similarly, you don't find large deposits of mineral oil and gas in China, for example, or in Asia per se, except a few parts of Asia and Indian subcontinent. Now, how or what kind of implications does that have on globe from a multi-dimensional standpoint? So that is leading to a trade imbalance. That is also leading to over dependency of countries like India, wherein we are forced to import 80% of our mineral oil and gas requirements from countries such as Russia, US, and basically Middle East. And that basically leads to a lot of our forex reserves or foreign exchange being drained out because of these huge amounts of import, which we are forced to have because of this uneven distribution of oil and gas reserves across the globe. So that is one dimension, which is forex reserve economic. Second one could be skills based. For example, a lot of our labor migrates out to Middle East countries to work in these gas and oil fields. I also migrated out to Russia, Azerbaijan, US, Australia, etc. to work in those oil and gas fields. That could be another dimension. Third dimension could be geopolitical, because India also understands that we are heavily dependent for energy requirements, traditional fossil fuel requirement on Middle East, US, Russia, etc. So we are forced to basically maintain friendly relations to ensure that we do continue to get uninterrupted supplies of energy through these channels of large holders of mineral oil across the globe. So that could be third implication. Fourth implication could be people to people exchange. Fifth implication could be development of new basically science and technology in basically areas which might be concerned with extraction of mineral oil and gas across the world. Seventh could be trade routes, for example. Why South China Sea is so important? Because a large amount of oil and gas gets traded through it. Similarly, when we talk about Strait of Malacca, that is very important when it comes to Chinese supplies, and that's why India wants to basically maintain significant naval presence in the Indo-Pacific, in the Andamans, through the theater command, integrated theater command, which we established in the Andamans. So there could be multiple different multi-dimensional implications of this uneven distribution of mineral oil in the world. So that's question number 16 for you. Question number 17. What are the main socio-economic implications arising out of the development of IT industries in major cities of India? Very relevant question. And I think you could nicely write an answer to this question thinking in your head about different IT industrial hubs across the country. So the question is main socio-economic implications, first part of the puzzle, and arising out of that is happening because of development of IT industries in major cities of India. What are major socio-economic implications of development of these cities which are basically being led by IT industries? So think about yourself. When you say IT industries, what comes to your mind? Bangalore, Hyderabad, Gurgaon, Noida, I would say the whole of NCR, and some other small basically centers. Chennai. What has happened? Because of development of IT industries, how socio-economic changes or what kind of socio-economic implications have happened in those cities? Bangalore is a classic example of it. Bangalore traditionally has been a very, very small city. It used to be a hill station inhabiting a very small size of population. But because of development of IT industries, the population has grown exponentially. That has led to huge amounts of urbanization. That has led to people from all parts of the country, a lot of global folks as well, coming down to Bangalore in basically search of new employment opportunities in basically the IT industries. And IT industry has led to a lot of urbanization, coming up of residential complexes, a lot of research and development. That has basically led to a lot of FDI inflow into Bangalore. Similar is the case with Hyderabad, similar is the case with Chennai, similar to the case with Gurgaon, Noida, and the entire basically NCR region. That has also led to, from a society standpoint, wherein people from very different backgrounds, in Bangalore you might have people who might be speaking Kannada, there could be people who might be speaking nearby Tamil, or basically Telugu, or Hindi, or Marathi, or Punjabi, or Kashmiri, or Rajasthani, being all basically in a very metropolitan environment. Similarly, education system has evolved, have seen an impact of this new conglomeration or this new commingling of these different factors. Similarly, there are also changes when it comes to economics, different kind of economic activities, rapid urbanization, coming up of new airports, coming up of new automobile industries, and that is how Bangalore is not only domestically but also internationally recognized as Silicon Valley of India. And I would say not only India, but I would say Silicon Valley of Asia. It means it does supply large amount of soft skills or service industry skills to not only Indian needs but also global needs. So this is how you start to map different socio-economic, political, globalization, urbanization, related people to people, economic activity, trade standpoint, all these things which are related to the central theme of development of IT industries in major cities of India. You basically do also have negative impacts of it. And what are those negative impacts? You have started to see major basically urbanization issues. Like we just talked about, urban flooding has become a major issue because a large part of the wetlands, waterlands have been reclaimed for urban land usage. So that has been a negative side. Second negative side is unplanned urbanization, unauthorized urbanization. Third thing is a lot of folks are basically getting crowded into these cities, which is unsustainable. It means it has led to crowding out of resources from small other cities, which could otherwise have been developed, which could have taken this load off these big cities. That has not happened in India just yet. So that is also considered as a negative implication or negative socio-economic implication of basically, having these IT industries concentrated in the major cities of India. Other basically negative impact could be development of slums, for example in Mumbai, for example in NCR region, because influx is large, we don't have enough accessible or affordable residential housing basically programs or complexes for a large part of our population. So they basically get forced to live in very inhospitable conditions. So this is also a important socio-economic implication, but on the negative side of it. So you do have a lot of positive implications. You do have some negative implications which have occurred because of development of IT industries in major parts of India. So that is question number 17 for you. Question number 18. Discuss the main objectives of population education and point out the measures to achieve them in India in detail. So be careful. When I read this question the first time, I did commit the same mistake. I thought this is more about basically population education, means educating the large parts of population. But that is not what population education is. You must focus on the word. Under time pressure, you do have this tendency to overlook keywords or start to infer what you actually know rather than what the question is asking you to answer. So population education is not about educating population. Population education is about imparting education about major events which might have a bearing because of different events related to population. For example, population growth. Population growth happens, what kind of implications it could have on economy, on households, on urbanization, on socialization, on globalization. Similarly, on our social structures, our cultures, our intermingling, etc. Or basically sustainability of our cities, villages, employment opportunities, poverties, or basically condition of women folk, or condition of marginalized sections, or condition of tribal population, etc., etc., etc. So, education about events related to population increase, population stabilization, population decrease, that is called population education. So, what are the objectives of population education? Of course, the objectives would be to tell people that why or how population could have an impact or bearing on different aspects of your life. It could basically change your economic life. It could change your social life. It could change your traditions and customs. It could change your global trade. It could change your connectivity. It could change your people-to-people contact. And why this question is relevant? Because recently, if you basically go to one of our playlists, you will also have, particularly the healthcare one, you will have findings of National Family Health Survey 5. It means NFHS Survey 5. That is very clear cut, articulated that Indian population is no more increasing. In fact, we do have reached the replacement ratio of 2.1. And in fact, in South India, this has fallen beyond the replacement ratio of 2.1. So this whole discussion around that we are going to examine or witness a population explosion is a total fast. It's not relevant anymore, and thus our policies must now be retooled, refocused away from controlling population rather than empowering that population, giving them better job opportunities, giving them better health opportunities, giving them better education opportunities, increasing their basically levels of life, standards of their life. So this is what called population education. So these are the objectives, and this is how or what you can do to ensure that you do impart this population education to large sections of our society. This could be made a part of our school curriculum. This could be made a part of our university curriculum, higher education curriculum. Similarly, you could actually have different campaigns, focused approach campaigns about educating people about the events or basically the population could have in their lives, communities' lives, society's life, or the nation's different policies, approaches, programs, etc., etc., etc. So that when people get aware about what population could do to them, their household, their community, their district, their society, their nation, I think they will be in a better position to make informed decision, to make informed choices. That is basically what population education is all about. Question number 19. What is cryptocurrency? How does it affect global society? Has it been affecting Indian society also? If basically you go to our playlist, which is on current affairs, current economy, then this question is straight out of two of the lectures which we have delivered. The first lecture we delivered on cryptocurrency or distributed ledger technology or blockchain technology answers this question in its entirety. Also, it does basically answer and tie up to our next lecture, which is recent events which have happened when it comes to acceptance of cryptocurrencies or rejection or banning of cryptocurrencies in some of the countries, for example, in China, even in India. Now we are talking about regulating cryptocurrencies in India, but that bill has not been placed in before the parliament yet, but it will come sooner than later. So it has started to impact. Cryptocurrency has started to impact not only a select few, but the society at large, including Indian folks as well. Then if you basically go to Web 3.0 lecture under science and technology, there too, you basically will tie up that the next generation of internet too is tied to the cryptocurrency technology, because Web 3.0 will be based on blockchain technology, distributed ledger technology, and there through technology such as metaverse, etc., you will be in a position to basically interact real time with virtual environments, augmented reality environments, etc., etc., etc. So that's how define cryptocurrency, the status of it, how this has started to basically affect global society when it comes to the economic part of it, when it comes to the social part of it, the relationship part of it, the regulatory framework, the science and technology part of it, and how does the future basically look like. And in India, the current estimate is about $11 billion worth of cryptocurrencies have been purchased by Indian nationals. So it has a huge amount of bearing when it comes to Indians and Indian society as well. 3 lectures under economy current playlist and also science and technology Web 3.0 lecture. Last question, question number 20. How does Indian society maintain continuity in traditional social values? Enumerate the changes taking place in it. Question is fairly straightforward. It is talking about the traditional social values. Traditional social values, so break it down. It says Indian society, first part, maintain continuity. It means we have to demonstrate certain degree of continuity. In what? Traditional social values. It means first let's start to define what is called traditional social values. Traditional social values could be related to the kind of household. For example, we do still have some degree of continuity when it comes to the type of household which is most preferred in Indian society. Still, I think a lot of us folks do prefer joint families compared to nuclear families. And we do see a continuation of basically joint family system, not so much in urban areas, but certainly in rural areas. So that is one part of it, the type of family. Second one is basically relationship. Third one is basically intermingling. Fourth one is education system. Fifth one is basically art and culture. Sixth one could be festivals. Seventh one could be economic activities. So how they were in the past and how what part of them still basically is being continued in the Indian society, that will demonstrate your first part of the question, the continuity in those social value system. And the second part of the question says, enumerate the changes taking place in it. It means with time everything changes. Your social system changes, your social value system changes, your morals changes, your ethical values changes, etc., etc. Similarly, we also too have gone through change in traditional social values. So in the second part of the question, what you have to do is you have to basically illustrate that in the first part of the question, I did say that a lot of those elements are still being carried forward or being continued in the Indian society. But some of those elements or a lot of those elements have started to witness or have undergone through a lot of those changes. For example, family system. It used to be joint family. Now this has become more a nuclear, basically, family. Similarly, geriatric care. For example, the parents used to live with us before, but not anymore. Similarly, education system. How has that changed? Similarly, social systems. Similarly, art and culture, for example. You know, a lot of those festivals, for example, Chhath Puja. If you go 10 years back in time in Delhi, I think you will hardly hear about the festival of Chhath being celebrated in NCR. But this year, huge festival, large basically citizenry from eastern UP, Bihar, and also local citizenry have started to celebrate that festival. So there's been a lot of cross-pollination of these social values, cultural values all across the country. So that is what we have to demonstrate in question number 20. A degree of continuity and the changes which are taking place or the changes which the Indian society is going through when it comes to its traditional social values. So that's, folks, is the 20th question of GS1 General Studies paper number 1. I hope today's lecture has started to give you an orientation is how do you read the question? How do you correlate the question with the syllabus? How do you break the question down into 2 or 3 or different basically keywords? And then how do you keep the tail word in mind? Is it discuss? Is it enumerate? Is it examine? Is it just basically trace? Is it narrate? Is it differentiate? So in context of that, this is how you connect these 2 or these 3 basically different keywords. You start with the definition, give some facts, draw a diagram, connect linkages. And that's how you basically put up a very strong answer, which is definition, facts, figure, real examples. Not just hawabaji and gyan. Real examples with actual survey data, figure data, reports, constitutional values, and also then you eventually basically end up or finish any answer with on a positive note about what could be the way forward or where you basically see things going forward in future. I hope, friends, you like this basically detailed analysis of GS1 of Civil Services Examination 2021. Stay tuned for a detailed analysis of the next question papers and how should we look at them, what basically part of the syllabus gets mapped with those questions and those GS2, GS3, GS4 question papers. How could you approach those questions? What kind of answer writing technique or basically thought process you could follow? Stay tuned. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat.